she's not the hero we need, but she's the hero we deserve, or some such. She is the people's Joker. This is a movie that is trickling out in several cities. I think it's already in New York. It's in LA this weekend. We had to get to it because there's been just so much buzz about it, so much controversy around it. A certain studio is not happy that it exists. But we are happy that it does because it's wildly original. If you're not subscribed yet, you really should, because we'll always do something like this. When there's a weird little movie that everyone's talking about, we want to talk about it too. So come hang out with us. Alonso, what is the people's Joker about?
Gotham City is nothing but neon biker gangs, leather freaks, and cross-dressers. Is that what you want? Come home!
No, I won't, Mom. I'm gonna be a comedian.
So the People's Joker is set in a somewhat familiar world of the DC universe, but what it really is ultimately is a trans journey, as depicted through the characters that we know from the world of Batman. And so our protagonist is someone who lives in a household where they can't really talk about who they are or what they want, and move to Gotham to go into comedy and find out that if you're a man, yes, lots of opportunities, and if you're a woman, not so much. But because this person is realizing, I'm a woman and I'm a comedian, how do I make all these things work? Starts an anti-comedy club with the Penguin, falls in love with Mr. J, who is also trans, but who also turns out to be, mask toxic masculinity, I guess, and things get very complicated. But over the course of the film, Joker the Harlequin comes into her own, discovers her power, figures out who she is, and this is a hard one to describe, really, okay. and that's a good thing. It's because this is really not a film that I'm used to seeing either as a queer film or in the world of superheroics. We talk about, like, Stan Lee was sort of infamous for years. I mean, like, oh, well, comic books, these are the modern myths. We're creating the myths. And so much of literature and plays and films over the years has been like, I'm going to take Hamlet, or I'm going to take the myth of Sisyphus, or I'm going to take the labors of Hercules and apply them to my own personal story. And so Vera Drew, who is the director and co-writer here, is basically taking her trans coming out story and telling it through these characters that we sort of know, and using them as kind of mythological archetypes. Mm-hmm. It's also very funny, and it's also very experimental and odd, and she comes from the very Adult Swim, like Tim and Eric world. Mm-hmm. So it's got that kind of abrasive and in your face comedy going on. You have a character who has been medicated since childhood, to be like happy all the time. And so that's presented here as Smilex, which is the poison that the Jack Nicholson's Joker uses in the 1989 Batman to force people to smile all the time. So Vera Drew is telling this very kind of personal queer story. And it's funny, it just now occurred to me, this is maybe a cool double feature with that Orlando movie that came out last year, that's sort of like taking Virginia Woolf's Orlando and using it as a sort of political metatext to talk about the trans experience. Vera Drew is doing that with the Joker and Gotham City and the Batman universe.
This movie is so strange, and it creates such a fascinating high wire act because it is rooted in this comic book world that we know, but it's also so personal, but never feels navel gazing. It never feels like self-indulgent, because she's got such a sense of humor about herself, and such a way with like a brutal truth that she depicts through humor, that it makes everything seem accessible and maybe even relatable. Like, you don't need to have had this specific experience. Maybe you had a shitty childhood, or maybe you couldn't wait to get out of your hometown, or you felt misunderstood, or whatever. I think
or you got in a relationship with someone who gaslit you.
Totally. There's something that I think people can take away from this, even if they are not queer themselves. The wild mix of visuals here I found really daring too. And this has to have been a really low budget film. I can't imagine that this costs very much to do, but there's this wide array of different kinds of animation. And then, as you say, kind of Tim and Eric style, intentionally crude, like really bad graphics and green screen, but that's intentional. But then there's also like some elegance to some of it too, like the way she'll transition from one style to another in the storytelling. There's a thing with a puppet. There's a thing that takes place. Is it purgatory or is it hell? And that's odd too. Like, but there's a beauty to it anyway.
Yeah,
surprising.
It's the kind of thing where, like, this was, I think, also very much a kind of a COVID production where certain different pieces got farmed out to different artists who worked on it. But you get a vision that carries you through this whole thing. And so even though it varies wildly in terms of specific style, specific animation or media, like, you'll have stuff that's more sort of like 2D CGI, but then you'll have these sort of 3D rendered CG characters in there, but it feels cohesive from start to finish, because I think Drew has a real lock on the story that she's telling and how she wants to do it. And her performance, I think, is so, is empathetic and moving. And so you want this character to succeed, even in this weirdly cartoony, larger than life atmosphere.
She's so likable, and she makes fun of herself in a wry way that is very disarming. But there's also a great deal of vulnerability there, as far as when she's telling stories about awful things that happened to this character, that's her story. And so the fact that she's putting it out there and making herself vulnerable in that way is quite moving. And then there's a whole other thing where the comedy place is called UCB, but it stands for something. It stands for something different. And then, like, there's clearly like a pipeline from that into SNL, which is, some of the small roles here are from big name people like Tim Heidecker, Bob Odenkirk, Maria Bamford. So clearly Vera is esteemed among a certain kind of really well-established comic, if they all wanted to come and help her here with this.
Scott Aukerman.
But that says a lot about, the way she's poking holes in the larger than life mythology of a thing like Saturday Night Live, an institution like that. And she is looking at it in a clear-eyed way that's very illuminating. So I just did not even know what to make of this from one minute to the next, but I was always riveted, because it's just, in its artifice, a lot of truth comes out. And that's so interesting about it. And also, I love that Warner Brothers is pissed about it.
They are, but I mean, not to the point where they're actively trying to shut this thing down. I mean, like, I think the opening title refers to this as like a fair use film by Vera Drew. And so I think they were able to work out some sort of rapprochement, and ultimately, I'm sure for Warner Brothers, it's like, if they just sort of let it happen, it's going to give it less publicity than if they actively fight it. They know how this sort of thing works. And so, Altered Innocence, who's a really great, tiny distributor that does very cool, like physical media and theatrical releases. And, they have picked up this movie and are running with it. And so it's great that, yes, you probably heard it muttered about when it had its one screening at TIFF or when it was at Sundance, but now it is actually quite likely showing up in a theater near you.
And there's some really funny little Batman things, like lines from previous Batman movies, like the way they make fun of certain characters, like the thing with Bane is funny. Just, I mean, if you like Batman and you like that whole mythology, you'll enjoy the way they make fun of it. Yeah,
and not just the movies, like the comics too. Like there's a whole thing right out of like Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns that's very specific to the plot and germane to what's going on. So yeah, she's clearly very well versed in this universe and knows who these characters are and has found a way to apply them to her own life, which again is like, people are always doing it with, Hamlet or whatever. Like, there are these sort of, these kind of archetypal stories that allow for new interpretations and allow for personal interpretations. And this filmmaker is just doing that with, this IP that we know.
What's your number?
We say like a 9.2. I think it's really bold and unlike anything I've ever seen. And I really hope people check it out.
I will say an 8. So we're going to put a link down in the description to where you can find this, because on the People's Joker website is a very detailed schedule of where it's playing when. So hopefully it'll be playing near you soon and you can check it out too.